Freemasonry and Judaism, Secret Powers Behind Revolution, by Vicompte Leon de Poncins, continuing with Judaism and Bolshevism. A number of their writers, such as Bernard Lazare, Alfred Nossig, Cadmy Cohen, have described this agreement between the two poles of Judaism, international Jewish capitalism and communism. We find ourselves, therefore, face to face with this enigma: how to explain that the Jews in general, and great Jewish financiers in particular, spread and support everywhere the socialism and Bolshevism which are destructive of that capital which is one of their most powerful forces. The reply is, understandable or not, it is a fact. It is very evident that they act thus in their own interest, and our naivety probably makes them smile. Here is what M. Georges Batalte says on this subject. The mode of government, which is the most propitious for the full development of the class war, is the demagogic regime, which is equally favorable to the twofold intrigues of finance and revolution. When this struggle is let loose in a violent form, the leaders of the masses are kings, but money is God. The demagogues are the masters of the passions of the mob, but the financiers are the masters of the demagogues. And it is the last resort, the widely spread riches of the country, rural property, real estate, which, for as long as they last, must pay for the movement. When the demagogues prosper amongst the ruins of social and political order and overthrown traditions, gold is the only power which counts. It is the measure of everything. It can do everything and reigns without hindrance in opposition to all countries, to the detriment of the city, of the nation, or of the empire, which are finally ruined. In doing this, do not financiers work against themselves? It may be asked, in destroying the established order, do not they destroy the source of all riches? This is perhaps true in the end, but whilst states which count their years by human generations are obliged, in order to ensure their existence, to conceive and conduct a far-sighted policy in view of a distant future, finance, which gets its living from what is present and tangible, always follows a short-sighted policy in view of rapid results and success without troubling itself about the morrows of history. It must never be forgotten that capitalists are of two kinds: proprietors, industrialists, and others, generally Christians, and international financiers, principally, though not exclusively, Jews. While social disorder is fatal to the first, it furnishes opportunities of profit to the second. From the strictly financial point of view, the most disastrous events of history, wars or revolutions, never produce catastrophes. The manipulators of money can make profit out of everything provided that they are well informed beforehand. It is certain that the Jews scattered over the whole surface of the earth are particularly well placed in this respect. They have, moreover, a personal motive for supporting socialism. One of them, Weiniger, has explained for us why so many Jews are communists. Communism is not only a national belief, but it implies the giving up of real property, especially of landed property, and the Jews, being international, have never acquired the taste for real property. They prefer money, which is an instrument of power. This is exactly what has happened in Russia. Property has there been suppressed for the benefit of the state, that is to say, for the profit of the Jew, since in fact the state is Jewish, as it will always be in every socialist state. because of the inherent qualities of the chosen people. The so-called dictatorship of the proletariat is in reality the dictatorship of the Jews. They do not wish to destroy capital, but to be the only masters of it. Collectivism is then neither a popular movement nor an end in itself, but a means of destruction. The directors accept a few Jewish fanatics who judge the world with their brain and not with their soul. Know better than anybody that the system cannot work. It has been tried several times in the best possible conditions and has rapidly and completely failed. It can only function in the case of a religious community having abandoned all worldly interest, or in that of nomads living by their flocks in large, uninhabited areas. Far from being progress, it is a return of the most primitive form of organization. It is impossible that a modern nation given over to Bolshevism should not die of hunger. We have an example of this in Russia, which before the war was the granary of Europe, now devastated by periodical famines for as long as communism has been applied to its countryside. What would conditions be in England or in Germany? We are told that socialism is the revolt of the workers oppressed by capitalism, that it is the rising of those who have nothing against those who possess. In this connection, let us remark in passing that all the money is rather on the side of those who have nothing. The anti-revolutionary organizations are indeed constantly hindered by lack of funds, whilst this difficulty does not exist for the revolutionary socialist parties, which have obviously at their disposal limitless resources. Socialism is not, moreover, a popular movement. The socialist intellectual may write of the beauties of nationalization, of the joy of working for the common good without hope of personal gain. The revolutionary working man sees nothing to attract him in all this. Question him on his ideas of social transformation, and he will generally express himself in favor of some method by which he will acquire something he has not got. He does not want to see the rich man's motor car socialized by the state. He wants to drive about it himself. The revolutionary working man is thus in reality not a socialist, but an anarchist at heart. Nor, in some cases, is this unnatural, that the man who enjoys none of the good things of life should wish to snatch his share, must at least appear comprehensible. What is not comprehensible is that he should wish to renounce all hope of ever possessing anything. Collectivism, or socialism and Bolshevism, is then neither a popular movement nor an end in itself, but a means, an outstanding means of destruction. The Tsarist autocracy was the last material obstacle. There remains still a moral obstacle, Rome and religions in general, which barred the way to Jewish imperialism in its conquest of the world. We have considerable Jewish testimony on the subject. Russia was the only country in the world in which the directing class opposed an organized resistance to universal Judaism. At the head of the state was an autocrat beyond the reach of parliamentary pressure. The high officials were independent, rich, and so saturated with religious and political traditions that Jewish capital, with a few rare exceptions, had no influence on them. Jews were not admitted in the services of the state, in judiciary functions, or in the army. The directing class was independent of Jewish capital because it owned great riches in lands and forest. Russia possessed wheat in abundance and continually renewed her provision of gold from the mines of the Urals and Siberia. The metal supply of the state comprised 4,000 million marks, without including the accumulated riches of the imperial family, of the monasteries, and of the private properties. In spite of her relatively little developed industry, Russia was able to live self-supporting. All these economic conditions rendered it almost impossible for Russia to be made the slave of international Jewish capital by the means which had succeeded in Western Europe. If we add, moreover, that Russia was always the abode of the religious and conservative principles of the world, that with the aid of her army she had crushed all serious revolutionary movements, and that she did not permit any secret political societies on her territory, it will be understood why world Jewry was obliged to march to the attack of the Russian Empire. Russia was an obstacle which Bolshevism has destroyed. In the Soviet Revolution, the anarchy at the beginning, the pillage, the seizure of lands, was the peculiarly Russian side. This anarchy rapidly gave place to Jewish organization. Today, the Russians have no longer the right to say anything in their own country. To begin with, the Slav anarchists have been promptly exterminated by the Jewish Bolshevists. The struggle of Bakunin against Karl Marx, of anarchy against communism, was the struggle of two opposite principles and two opposite races, Slavism against Judaism. Thus, one may agree with M. Lekoch, who, as he was a former Russian revolutionary condemned under Tsarism, can hardly be accused of possessing a reactionary spirit. Bolshevism, this symbol of chaos and of the spirit of destruction, is above all an anti-Christian and anti-social conception. This present destructive tendency is clearly advantageous for only one national and religious entity, Judaism. The fact that Jews are the most active element in present-day revolutions, as well as in revolutionary socialism, that they draw to themselves the power forced from the people of other nations by revolution, is a fact in itself, independent of the question of knowing if that comes from organized worldwide Judaism, from Jewish Freemasonry, or by an elementary evolution brought about by Jewish national solidarity and the accumulation of capital in the hands of Jewish bankers. The contest is becoming more definite. The domination of revolutionary Judaism in Russia and the open support given to this Jewish Bolshevism by Judaism the world over finally clear up the situation, show the cards, and put the question of the battle of Christianity against Judaism, of the national state against the international, that is to say, in reality, against Jewish world power. It must not be ignored, however, that there is an ideology of socialism and that it has only triumphed in Russia thanks to the resolute fanaticism of its pioneers, Lenin, Trotsky, and others. In order to understand Bolshevism clearly, we must not lose sight of the extraordinary medley which characterizes the Jewish mind. On the one hand, messianic fanatical idealism, which intends to direct humanity by imposing upon it Jewish ideas. On the other hand, a practical judgment, most prudent and most materialistic. To the first, we owe international socialism. To the second, our present economic civilization, in which gold is king. Fanaticism explains Bolshevism. The practical business sense explains why Jewish high finance has supported Bolshevism for racial interest. For the end in view, the domination of the world, is the same for both. Socialism represents the spiritual side, high finance the material side. The following lines, written by a Hungarian lady during the Bolshevist rule, well expresses the opinion of those who lived through these tragic hours. There is little resemblance between the mystical and undecided Slav, the violent but tradition-living Magyar, and the heavy, deliberate German. And yet Bolshevism wove the same web all over them all, by the same means and with the same tokens. The national temperament of the three races does not the least reveal itself in the terrible conceptions which have been accomplished, in complete agreement, by men of the same mentality in Moscow, Budapest, and Munich. From the very beginning of the dissolution in Russia, Kerensky was on the spot. Then came Trotsky, on which, in the shadow of Lenin. When Hungary was fainting, weak from loss of blood, Kunfi, Jassy, and Pagani were waiting behind Karolyi, and behind them came Bela Kun and his staff. And when Bavaria tottered, Kurt Eisner was ready to produce the first act of the revolution. In the second act, it was Max Levin, or Levy, who proclaimed the dictatorship of the proletariat at Munich, a further edition of Russian and Hungarian Bolshevism. So great are the specific differences between the three races that the mysterious similarity of these events cannot be due to any analogy between them, but only to the work of a fourth race living amongst the others, but unmingled with them. Among modern nations with their short memories, the Jewish people is the last representative of ancient Oriental civilization. As heir to the biblical traditions, it fervently invokes the hour in which will be realized the great calamities prophesied so many centuries ago. Whether despised or feared, it remains an eternal stranger. It comes without invitation and remains even when driven out. It is scattered and yet coherent. It takes up its abode in the very body of the nations. It creates laws beyond and above the laws. It denies the idea of a homeland, but it possesses its own homeland, which it carries along with it and establishes wherever it goes. It denies the God of other peoples and everywhere rebuilds the temple. It complains of its isolation, and by mysterious channels it links together the parts of the infinite New Jerusalem, which covers the whole universe. It has connections and ties everywhere, which explains how capital and the press, concentrated in its hands, conserve the same designs in every country of the world, and the interests of the race, which are identical in Ruthenian villages and in the city of New York. If it extols someone, he is glorified all over the world. And if it wishes to ruin someone, the work of destruction is carried out as if directed by a single hand. The orders come from the depths of mysterious darkness. That which the Jew jeers at and destroys among other peoples, it fanatically preserves in the bosom of Judaism. If it teaches revolt and anarchy to others, it in itself shows admirable obedience to its invisible guides. In the time of the Turkish Revolution, a Jew said proudly to my father, "It is we who are making it, we, the young Turks, the Jews." During the Portuguese Revolution, I heard the Marquis de Vasconcelos, Portuguese ambassador at Rome, say, "The Jews and the Freemasons are directing the revolution in Lisbon." Today, when the greater part of Europe is given up to the revolution, they are everywhere leading the movement, according to a single plan. How did they succeed in concealing this plan which embraced the whole world, and which was not the work of a few months or even years? They used as a screen men of each country, blind, frivolous, venal, froward, or stupid, and who knew nothing, and thus they worked in security. These redoubtable organizers, these sons of an ancient race which knows how to keep a secret, and that is why none of them has betrayed the others. But the Bolshevist revolution has a deeper meaning. We find in it the dominating idea of all the revolutions since 1789, the destruction of present-day civilization. The final goal of world revolution is not socialism or even communism. It is not a change in the present economic system. It is not the destruction of civilization in a material sense. The revolution desired by the leaders is moral and spiritual. It is an anarchy of ideas, in which all the bases established 19 centuries ago shall be overthrown, all the honored traditions trodden underfoot, and above all, the Christian ideal finally obliterated. It is a struggle between two different conceptions of the world, the Jewish conception and the Christian conception. The inward thought of Moscow indeed appears to be that for 20 centuries, while humanity has been following Christ, it has been on the wrong road. It is now high time to correct this error of direction by creating a new moral code, a new civilization, founded on quite different principles, and it appears that it is the idea which the communist leaders wished to symbolize when a few months ago they proposed to erect in Moscow a statue to Judas Iscariot, to Judas, this great, honest, misunderstood man who hanged himself, not at all, as it is usually and foolishly believed, because of remorse for having sold his master, but because of despair. Poor man, at the thought that humanity would pay for, by innumerable misfortunes, the wrong path which it was about to follow. Here is a circular of the Communist Party which illustrates this point. In our decrees, it is definitely proclaimed that religion is a question for the private individuals, but whilst opportunists tended to see in these words the meaning that the state would adopt the policy of folded arms, the Marxian revolutionary recognizes the duty of the state to lead a most resolute struggle against religion by means of ideological influences on the proletarian masses. The struggle against God has been led with fierce determination and with bloodthirsty hate. The most degrading means have been employed in it, such as the systematic demoralization of young people through teaching in the schools the lowest sexual instincts, the organized destruction of the family by the abolition of marriage and the socialization of women, the massacre of the Russian clergy, the transformation of the churches into dance halls and cabarets, the spiritual division of the church by the creation of the living church, etc. In this somber tragedy, there are occasional comic interludes. In 1923, Trotsky and Lunacharsky presided over a meeting in Moscow organized by the propaganda section of the Communist Party to judge God. 5,000 men of the Red Army were present. The accused was found guilty of various ignominious acts, and having had the audacity to fail to appear, he was condemned in default. Bolshevism is then the logical application in Russia of the revolutionary plan which we see developing in the world since 1789. Its essence is the same. We have only seen up to the present the destructive phase. This takes different forms according to countries and to circumstances. Bolshevism is the Russian form, or to be exact, the form applied to Russia, for it is only Russian insofar as it is taking place in Russia, and that they are Russians who suffer from it. Now that we are beginning to see more clearly what has happened in that unfortunate country, the prophecy contained in the following extract seems all the more impressive. It is from a book by Copen Albincelli, published in 1909, La Conjuration Juve contre les pupils. There is in existence a plan of world organization about which much has been said for several years past, in favor of which determined propaganda has been made among the masses, and towards which our present rulers are causing us to slide gradually and unconsciously. We mean to say the socialist collectivist organization. It is that which is most in harmony with the character, the aptitudes, and the means of action of the Jewish race. It is that which bears the signature, the trademark of this new reigning people. It is that which it wishes to impose on the Christian world, because it is only by this means that it can dominate the latter. Instead of wearing a military or political character, the dictatorship imposed by the Jewish race will be a financial, industrial, commercial dictatorship. At least for a time, it will show itself as little as possible. The Jews have endowed the commercial, industrial, and financial world with the joint stock company, thanks to which they are able to hide their immense riches. They will endow the entire Christian world with that which they have bestowed on France, the joint stock company for the exploitation of nations called Republic, thanks to which they will be able to hide their kingship. We are moving then towards the universal republic, because it is only thus that Jewish financial, industrial, and commercial kingship can be established. But under its republican mask, this kingship will be infinitely more despotic than any other. It will be exactly that which man has established over the animal. The Jewish race will maintain its hold upon us by our needs. It will rely on a strongly organized and carefully chosen police, so generously paid that it will be ready to do anything, just as the presidents of republics, who are given 1,200,000 francs and who are chosen especially for the purpose, are ready to put their signature to anything. Beyond the police, nothing but workmen on one side, and on the other, engineers, directors, administrators. The workers will be all the non-Jews. The engineers, directors, and administrators will, on the contrary, be Jews. We do not say the Jews and their friends. We say the Jews. For the Jews will have no more friends, and they will be 100 times right in such a situation to rely only upon those who will be of the race. This may all seem impossible to us, and nevertheless it will come about in the most natural way in the world, because everything will have been prepared secretly, as the revolution was. In the most natural way in the world, we say, in this sense that there must always be engineers, directors, and administrators, so that the human flock may work and live, and that, furthermore, the reorganization of the world, which we shall have disorganized, cannot be operated save by those who will have previously gathered in wealth everywhere. By reason of this privileged situation, which we are allowing to become established for their benefit, the Jews alone will be in a position to direct everything. The peoples will put their hand to the wheel to bring about this state of things. They will collaborate in the destruction of all other power than that of the state, as long as they are allowed to believe that the state, this state which possesses all, is themselves. They will not cease to work for their own servitude, until the day when the Jews will say to them, "We beg your pardon. You have not understood. The state, this state, which owns everything, is not you, it is us." The people will then wish to resist, but it will be too late to prevent it, because all moral forces, having ceased to exist, all material forces will have been shattered by that same cause. Sheep do not resist the sheepdog trained to drive them and possessing strong jaws. All that the working class could do would be to refuse to work. The Jews are not simpletons enough not to foresee that. They will have provisions for themselves and for their watchdogs. They will allow famine to subdue resistance. If the need should arise, they would have no scruple in hurling on the people, mutinous but unarmed, their police made invincible, because they will be provided with the most up-to-date weapons against powerless mobs. We have not already a vision of the invincibility of organized forces against the crowd. France has known, and she has not forgotten, the rule of the Masonic terror. She will know, and the world will know with her, the rule of the Jewish terror. Here are the few details of this terror in Russia. First of all, the principles of it. In the beginning, the Red Terror was first of all intended to exterminate the Russian intelligentsia. The extraordinary commissions are not a medium of justice, but of extermination without mercy, according to the expression of the Central Communist Committee. The Extraordinary Commission is not a commission of inquiry, nor a court of justice, nor a tribunal. It decides for itself its own powers. It is a medium of combat which operates on the interior front of the Civil War. It does not judge the enemy, but exterminates them. It does not pardon those who are on the other side of the barricade. It crushes them. It is not difficult to imagine how this extermination without mercy operates in reality when, instead of the dead code of the laws, there reigns only revolutionary experience and conscience. Conscience is subjective, and experience must give place to the pleasure and whims of the judges. We are not making war against individuals in particular, writes Latsis in the Red Terror of November 1918. We are exterminating the bourgeoisie as a class. Do not look in the enquiry for documents and proofs of what the accused person has done in acts or words against the Soviet authority. The first question which you must put to him is, to what class does he belong? What are his origins, his education, his instruction, his profession? In fact, communism only maintains itself by a general terror, and in the end, the working and peasant classes have suffered as much as the others. Once launched on the way of massacres, extermination has been carried out at random in order to impose communist rule by general terror. One of the Soviet leaders, who at least possesses the merit of frankness, has dared to write, "Yes, certainly your Russia is dying. There no longer exists anywhere, if it has ever existed, a single class of the population for which life is harder than in our Soviet paradise. We make experiments on the living body of the people. Devil take it. Exactly like a first-year student working on a corpse of a vagabond which he has procured in the anatomy operating theater. Read our two constitutions carefully. It is there frankly indicated that it is not the Soviet Union nor its parts which interests us, but the struggle against world capital and the universal revolution to which we have always sacrificed everything, to which we are sacrificing the country, to which we are sacrificing ourselves. It is evident that the sacrifice does not extend to the Zinovievs. Here, in our country, we are absolute masters. We fear no one at all. The country worn out by wars, sickness, death, and famine, it is a dangerous but splendid means, no longer dares to make the slightest protest, finding itself under the perpetual menace of the Cheka and the army. Often we are ourselves surprised by its patience, which has become so well known. There is not, one can be certain, in the whole of Russia, a single household in which we have not killed in some manner or other the father, the mother, a brother, a daughter, a son, some near relative or friend. Very well then, Felix Dzerzhinsky nevertheless walks quietly about Moscow without any guard, even at night. When we remonstrate with him for these walks, he contents himself with laughing disdainfully and saying, "What? They would never dare. Tsarker." And he's right. They do not dare. What a strange country. Better than any dry statistics, the following description by a witness will give an idea of the scale upon which these butcheries are made. When the Rohrberg Commission of Inquiry entered Kiev after the taking of the town by the Volunteer Army in August 1919, it found the execution hall of the Cheka in the following state. All the cement floor of the great garage, the execution hall of the departmental Cheka of Kiev, was flooded with blood. This blood was no longer flowing. It formed a layer of several inches. It was a horrible mixture of blood, brains, of pieces of skull, tufts of hair, and other human remains. All the walls, riddled by thousands of bullets, were besplattered with blood. Pieces of brains and of scalps were sticking to them. A gutter 25 centimeters wide by 25 centimeters deep and about 10 meters long ran from the center of the garage towards a subterranean drain. This gutter, along its whole length, was full to the top of blood. Usually, as soon as the massacre had taken place, the bodies were conveyed out of the town in motor lorries and buried beside the grave about which we have spoken. We found in a corner of the garden another grave which was older and contained about 80 bodies. There we discovered on the bodies traces of cruelty and mutilations, the most varied and unimaginable. Some bodies were disemboweled. Others had limbs chopped off. Some were literally hacked to pieces. Some had their eyes put out and the head, face, neck, and trunk covered with deep wounds. Further on, we found a corpse with a wedge driven into the chest. Some had no tongues. In a corner of the grave, we discovered a certain quantity of arms and legs. We have no exact documents permitting us to estimate exactly the total number of victims. The figures given exceed imagination. Professor Sorelia gives in the Scotsman 7th November 1923 the following figures. 28 bishops, 1,219 priests, 6,000 professors and teachers, 9,000 doctors, 54,000 officers, 260,000 soldiers, 70,000 policemen, 12,950 property owners, 535,250 members of the intellectual and liberal professions, 193,290 workmen, 618,000 peasants. The Commission of Inquiry of Denikin on Bolshevist proceedings during the period 1918 through 1919, in an account of the Red Terror, computed 1,700,000 victims. Elsewhere, a theoretical computation has been made by Ev Komnin in the Rule. During the winter of 1920, the Union of the Soviet Socialist Republics comprised 52 governments with 52 extraordinary commissions, or Cheka, 52 special sections, and 52 revolutionary tribunals. Moreover, numberless Este Chekas. Chekas for transport systems, Chekas for railways, tribunals for troops for internal security, flying tribunals sent for mass executions on the spot, To this list of torture chambers, these special sections must be added. 16 army and divisional tribunals. In all, 1,000 chambers of torture must be reckoned, and if we take into consideration that there existed at this time cantonal Chekas, we must add even more. Since then, the number of Soviet governments has grown. Siberia, the Crimea, the Far East have been conquered. The number of Chekas has grown in geometrical proportion. According to direct data, in 1920, when the Red Terror had not diminished and information on the subject had not been reduced, it was possible to arrive at a daily average figure for each tribunal. The curve of execution rises from 1 to 50, the latter figure in the big centers, and up to 100 in regions recently conquered by the Red Army. The crises of terror were periodical, then they ceased, so that it is possible to establish the modest figure of 5 victims a day, which multiplied by the number of 1,000 tribunals gives 5,000 and about 1.5 million per annum. However unbelievable these figures may appear, these 3 different sets of statistics are sufficiently in agreement and have certainly a strong foundation of truth. The Red Terror became so widespread that it is impossible to give here all the details of the principal means employed by the Cheka to master resistance. One of the most important is that of hostages taken among all social classes. These are held responsible for any anti-Bolshevist movements, revolts, the White Army, strikes, refusal of a village to give its harvest, etc., and are immediately executed. Thus, for the assassination of the Jew Oritsky, member of the Extraordinary Commission of Petrograd, several thousands of them were put to death, and many of these unfortunate men and women suffered before death various tortures inflicted by cold-blooded cruelty in the prisons of the Cheka. Thus, I have in front of me photographs taken at Kharkov in the presence of the Allied missions immediately after the Reds had abandoned the town. They consist of a series of ghastly reproductions such as bodies of 3 workmen taken as hostages from a factory which went on strike. One had his eyes burnt, his lips and nose cut off. The other 2 had their hands cut off. The bodies of hostages S. Afaniasok and P. Propovich, small landed proprietors who were scalped by their executioners. S. Afaniasok shows numerous burns caused by a white, hot sword blade. The body of M. Bobrov, a former officer who had his tongue and one hand cut off and the skin torn off from his left leg. Human skin torn from the hands of several victims by means of a metallic comb. This sinister find was the result of a careful inspection of the cellar of the Extraordinary Commission of Kharkov. The retired general, Pontiafa, a hostage who had the skin of his right hand torn off and the genital parts mutilated. Mutilated bodies of women hostages. S. Yevanovna, owner of a drapery business. A. L. Karol Shaza, wife of a colonel. Kolopova, a property owner. They had their breasts slit and emptied, and the genital parts burnt and having traces of coal. Bodies of 4 peasant hostages, Bodorenko, Pukikal, Saventry, and Sidorfchuk, with atrociously mutilated faces, the genital parts having been operated upon by Chinese torturers in a manner unknown to European doctors, in whose opinion the agony caused to the victims must have been dreadful. It is impossible to enumerate all the forms of savagery which the Red Terror took. A volume would not contain them. The Cheka of Kharkov, for example, in which Saenko operated, had the speciality of scalping victims and taking off the skin of their heads as one takes off a glove. At Voronezh, the victims were shut up naked in a barrel studded with nails, which was then rolled about. Their foreheads were branded with a red-hot iron 5-pointed star. At Tsaritsyn and at Kamyshin, their bones were sawed. At Kiev, the victim was shut up in a chest containing decomposing corpses. After firing shots above his head, his torturers told him that he would be buried alive. The chest was buried and opened again a half-hour later, when the interrogation of the victim was proceeded with. The scene was repeated several times over. It is not surprising that many victims went mad. Let us recall that on the 17th July 1918, at Ekaterinenburg, and on the order of the Cheka, order given by the Jew Sverdlov from Moscow, the commission of execution commanded by the Jew Yarosky assassinated by shooting or by bayoneting the Tsar, Tsarina, Tsarevich, the 4 Grand Duchesses, Dr. Botkin, the manservant, the woman-servant, the cook, and the dog. The members of the imperial family, in closest succession to the throne, were assassinated in the following night. The Grand Dukes Mikhailovich, Konstantinovich, Vladimir Paley, and the Grand Duchess Elizabeth Fyodorovna were all thrown down a well at Alpavsk in Siberia. The Grand Duke Michael Alexandrovich was assassinated at Perm with his suite. Dostoevsky was not right when she said, "An odd fancy sometimes comes into my head. What would happen in Russia if instead of 3 million Jews, which are there were 3 million Russians and 80 million Jews? What would have happened to these Russians among the Jews, and how would they have been treated? Would they have been placed on an equal footing with them? Would they have permitted them to pray freely? Would they not have simply made them slaves, or even worse, would they not have simply flayed the skin from them? Would they not have massacred them until completely destroyed, as they did with other peoples of antiquity in the times of their olden history? What is going to happen in Russia now? The present situation is as follows. Bolshevism, the agent of destruction, has accomplished its mission. Its very violence prevents it from lasting eternally. The time has come to proceed gradually to a durable form of government. In the nature of the French Republic, a most convenient form for cloaking the real masters, it would permit Jewry to establish itself definitely in Russia and to benefit fully from the victory obtained, thanks to Bolshevism, over the Russian people. Unfortunately, the Soviet leaders, probably exceeding orders, have gone too far, which has had for them the disadvantage of showing to some extent their cards. People have begun to see that the world revolution was partially artificial, the work of a conspiracy directed principally by the Jews. Thus, communism is only maintained in Russia by the terror. As soon as it is relaxed, pogroms appear. In consequence, world Jewry and Masonic governments, such as that of France, for example, pretend to blame Bolshevism by condemning its unpopular excesses, while in fact they are supporting it and making it last until the means are found for it to evolve into a more lasting form. If it were to fall at present, the reaction would be such that it is doubtful whether Judeo-Masonry, with all its power, would be able to prevent the reestablishment of a national and religious Russia governed by a monarchist leader with absolute power. It would be a catastrophe for Judeo-Masonry, which will do the utmost to avoid it, for the world would then learn, with dismay, what Bolshevism really was. The true authors of world revolution and their objects would for the first time appear in the light of day, and it would be the end of a democratic, socialist, and other illusions. Russia, henceforth, a forbidden land to Freemasons, to Jews, and to international revolutionaries, and able, thanks to its natural resources, to be self-supporting without passing through the caudine forks of Jewish high finance, would be the base upon which the counter-revolutionary elements of the world would lean. These, instead of fighting blindly against an invisible subterranean enemy, would know whom to attack. It would be without doubt the beginning of a new general orientation of the world in order to deviate from the revolutionary slope down which it has been slipping since 1789. How does the civilized world permit such a state of things to reign over the sixth part of the earth? If there was still a monarchy in Russia, it goes without saying that nobody would admit it. There would be thundering questions in the parliaments of the two hemispheres, fiery protests from all the leagues of the rights of man, articles in the indignant newspapers, a rapid and unanimous understanding among all social classes, and a whole series of national, economic, diplomatic, and military measures for the destruction of this plague. But present-day democracy is much less troubled about it than about a cold of MacDonald or the broken nose of a carpentier. And although the Occidental bourgeoisie knows perfectly well that the Soviet power is its irreconcilable enemy, with which no understanding is possible, that, moreover, it would be useless, since economically Russia is nothing more than a corpse. Nevertheless, the flirtation of the bourgeoisie with the Comintern lasts and threatens to become a long romance. To this question there is only one answer. As in Western Europe, international Judaism holds in its hands political power as strongly as the Jewish communists hold it in Russia. It does all that is humanly possible to retard the day when the latter will fall. Jews and socialism. We have dwelt at length with Bolshevism, for it has shown the revolutionary action of the Jews in the full light of day. Their part in it has become apparent indeed during the violent revolution, but although less visible, they are nonetheless the directors of revolutionary socialism in all its forms all over the world. In that which concerns the Jews, their part in world socialism is so important that it is impossible to pass it over in silence. Is it not sufficient to recall the names of the great Jewish revolutionaries of the 19th and 20th centuries? Karl Marx, Lassalle, Kurt Eisner, Bela Kun, Trotsky, Leon Blum, so that the names of the theorists of modern socialism should at the same time be mentioned? If it is not possible to declare Bolshevism taken as a whole a Jewish creation, it is nevertheless true that the Jews have furnished several leaders to the maximalist movement, and that, in fact, they have played a considerable part in it. Jewish tendencies towards communism, apart from all material collaboration with party organizations, what a strong confirmation do they not find in the deep aversion which a great Jew, a great poet, Henry Heine, felt for Roman law. The subjective causes, the passionate causes of the revolt of Rabbi Akiba and of Bar Kokhba in the year 70 A.D. against the Pax Romana and the Jus Romanum were understood and felt subjectively and passionately by a Jew of the 19th century who apparently had maintained no connection with his race. Both the Jewish revolutionaries and the Jewish communists who attacked the principle of private property, of which the most solid monument is the Codex Juris Civilis of Justinianus, of Ulpian, etc., are doing nothing different from their ancestors who resisted Vespasian and Titus. In reality, it is the dead who speak. Jews were the creators of socialism, the great prophet of the collectivist idea, and the founder of the International. Karl Marx was a Jew whose real name was Mordecai. Jews are the present leaders of the movement, and its funds are from Jewish sources, which explains perhaps the limitless amount of the resources at the disposal of the socialists. In France, the newspaper Humanites has been founded by Jewish money. It is the same for the greater part of socialist newspapers throughout the world. In England, the Jewish influence on the less extreme forms of socialism in this country is no less apparent. If the Labour Party is solidly pro-German, it is also solidly pro-Jewish. Moreover, on the subject of Jewish influence in socialism, nobody is more definite than one of the spiritual leaders of Judaism, Mr. Alfred Nossig, who says word for word in his book Le Judaisme Integral, or Integrales Judentum, socialism and the Mosaic Code are programs which are not at all in opposition. Between the fundamental ideas of the two doctrines, there is, on the contrary, a striking agreement. Jewish nationalism ought not to turn from socialism as from a danger which threatens its ideal, nor Jewish socialism turn from the Mosaic Code. The two parallel ideas will be realized by following the same road. From an examination of the facts, it emerges in an irrefutable manner that it is not only modern Jews who have cooperated in a decisive manner in the creation of socialism. Their own fathers were already the founders of the Mosaic system. Or in another form, the Mosaic system is socialism freed from the utopias and terror of communism, as well as from the assis of Christianity. The Mosaic Code throughout the ages, both as a doctrine and as a law, has influenced some consciously and others unconsciously. The modern socialist movement is in great part the work of the Jews. It was the Jews who imprinted upon it the mark of their brain. It was equally the Jews who had a preponderant part in the government of the first socialist republics, although the Jewish socialist leaders were for the most part estranged from Judaism, in spite of which the part which they played did not depend on them alone. In them was operating, in an unconscious fashion, the race-cultural system of the Mosaic doctrine. The blood of the old apostolic people was living in their brain and in their social temperament. Present-day world socialism forms the first stage in the accomplishment of the Mosaic teaching, the beginning of the realization of the future state of the world announced by our prophets. It is not until there will be a League of Nations, it is not until its allied armies will be employed in an efficacious manner for the protection of all the weak races, that we shall be able to hope that the Jews will be in a position to develop without hindrance their national state in Palestine, and equally, it will only be a League of Nations impregnated with the socialist spirit, which will render possible for us the possession of our international as well as our national requirements. This is why all Jewish groups, whatever they are, Zionists or adepts of the diaspora, have a vital interest in the victory of socialism. They must exact it not only on principle, not only because of its identity with the Mosaic doctrine, but also on tactical grounds. The Jewish socialist is reproached with playing a leading part not only in the collectivist party, but also in the communist terrorist party. This must be regretted by all Jews who, inasmuch as they are true disciples of the Mosaic teaching, disapprove of the terror. This is only explained by two reasons: the complete estrangement of the Jewish terrorists from the spirit of the Mosaic doctrine, and the strong mixture of Tartar and Cossack blood. That has not prevented the dissenters of Jewish race from being exalted in the socialist idea, but it has inculcated in them savage and cruel principles. We have just seen the preponderant part played by Judaism in the modern revolutionary movement, Bolshevism, socialism, etc. Let us now examine the direction of Jewish influence in the world in general and in the different branches of human activity. Jewish influence in the world. Throughout the world, and in all parts, Jewish activity is exercised consciously or unconsciously in a revolutionary direction destructive of Christian civilization. The two poles of the Jewish people, at the bottom, the socialist and Bolshevist revolutionaries, and at the top, high finance, are working in the same direction. Consciously or unconsciously, I have said, there is indeed a radical difference between the two conceptions of existence. The Jewish conception, which believes in the immense value of earthly life, the kingdom of God upon the earth, and which thrusts from it the hope of a future life, and the Christian conception, which is based on the inverse. Whether one admits or whether one denies the idea of a worldwide Jewish conspiracy, the fact remains nevertheless that since 1789 the Jewish idea is gaining the upper hand over the Christian idea, which has hitherto prevailed, and the general materialism which proceeds from it logically brings the atheism, the socialism, and the universal anarchy from which we are suffering. The Jewish question is then before everything a question of safeguarding our civilization and our culture, a question of changing the face of the world. Without us Aryans being conscious of it, the idealism pertaining to our race, that idealism which was so zealous throughout the ages for all that is beautiful, all that is noble, for sincerity, loyalty, right, duty, trust, all that is being irresistibly impelled by the seductive conception of Jewry towards a cynical and unscrupulous materialism, which finds its political expression in the Judeo-Masonic Universal Atheist Republic. The propagation of the Jewish idea is then destructive for us, and for spreading its ideas and putting them into practice, Judaism has, as its chief forces, gold and the press. Thanks to them, it directs or interferes with everything which acts on public opinion and everything which has a revolutionary influence in the world. Freemasonry, socialism, communism, theosophy, the theater, the cinema, news agencies, wireless, education, etc. It has an effective influence on most governments, either indirectly through Freemasonry or directly by selected Jewish nationals who surround and direct the leaders of the state and influential politicians, as we have seen in a preponderant fashion at the peace conference. The following are a few precisions on these various points. Jews and economic life. Jewish commercial and financial genius is too well known for it to be necessary to speak of it here. Jews have been the inventors of modern business methods. At present, they are the kings of finance. All the countries in which their influence is dominating enjoy the benefit of an intense economic activity. But what is the cost of such material advantage? No one has the right to blame their economic success, but one can examine the means which they employ to achieve it, and above all, the use which they make of their financial power. Gold is an instrument of power which can serve for good or evil. Up to the present, they have applied it in a way useful for the Jewish race, but harmful for all others. There is the whole question. Their economic influence is bad for us Occidental Christians in 3 ways. By the spread in the world of the Jewish mentality for gold, by the manner in which they acquire this gold, by the use which they make of it. The Jewish mentality for gold has a religious basis, for the principal characteristic of the Jewish religion consists in its being alien to the hereafter, a religion, as it were, solely and essentially worldly. Man can only experience good or evil in this world. If God wishes to punish or reward, he can only do so during the life of man. It is therefore here below that the just must prosper and the impious suffer. Thus the Jewish religion exalts riches as the supreme blessing, and money is for the Jew the aim of life. It is useless to insist upon the differences which proceed from this opposition between the 2 different views in the respective attitudes of the pious Jew and the pious Christian regarding the acquisition of wealth. While the pious Christian, who had been guilty of usury, was tormented on his deathbed by the tortures of repentance, and was ready to give up all that he owned for the possessions unjustly acquired, were scorching his soul, the pious Jew also, at the end of his days, looked with affection upon his coffers and chests filled to the top with the accumulated sequins taken during his long life from poor Christians, and even from poor Muslims. A sight which could cause his pious heart to rejoice, for every penny of interest enclosed therein was like a sacrifice offered to his God. Today, this mentality for gold has spread throughout the world. It has produced a general materialism and a harshness which is in part responsible for the class hatred, which is one of the great destructive elements of our time. It is the rule of the machine and commercialism, brutal and purely material, without any moral counterpoise to diminish the harm which it causes. The root cause of the evil is then the disappearance of all spiritual ideas. Dostoevsky had already declared this as far back as 1873 in this prophetic passage. Their kingdom is at hand, their perfect kingdom. The triumph of those ideas is approaching, in the presence of which the sentiments of humanity are mute, the thirst for truth, the Christian and national feelings, and even the common pride of the peoples of Europe. That which is coming, on the contrary, is materialism, the blind and grasping appetite for personal material well-being, the thirst for the accumulation of money by any means. That is all which is regarded as a higher aim, such as reason, such as liberty, instead of the Christian ideal of salvation by the sole means of the close moral and brotherly union between men. People will laugh at this and say that it does not in the least proceed from the Jews. Was the late James de Rothschild of Paris a bad man? We are speaking about Judaism and the Jewish idea, which has monopolized the whole world instead of defective Christianity. A thing will come about which nobody can yet even imagine. All this parliamentarianism, these theories regarding the community which are believed in today, these accumulations of wealth, the banks, science, all that will collapse in the winking of an eye and without leaving a trace behind, except the Jews, however, who will know then what they have to do, so that even this will be for their gain. All this is near, close by. Yes, Europe is on the eve of collapse, a universal, terrible, and general collapse. To me, Bismarck, Beaconsfield, the French Republic, Gambetta, and others are all only appearances. Their master, who is the same for everyone else and for the whole of Europe, is the Jew and his bank. We shall still see the day when he shall pronounce his veto, and Bismarck will be unexpectedly swept away like a piece of straw. Judaism and the banks now reign over all, as much over Europe as over education, the whole of civilization, and socialism, especially over socialism, for with its help Judaism will root out Christianity and destroy Christian culture. And if nothing but anarchy results, the Jew will be found, directing all, for although preaching socialism, he will remain nevertheless in his capacity of Jew, along with the brothers of his race, outside socialism, and when all the substance of Europe has been pillaged, only the Jewish bank will subsist. Capitalism, then, is not only an economic problem, it is a question of a spiritual problem before everything, of a problem of European soul. To conclude, the Jewish mentality for gold has invaded us, and this mentality is already in itself bad for us. But Jewish influence is also dangerous for us in two other ways. The manner in which they acquire gold and the use that they make of it. The Jews have always been reproached for being parasites, with never procuring their wealth by production, but by the exploitation of the production of others. It is one of themselves who has said, "Wars and revolutions are the harvests of the Jew." This is not a recent discovery. Here is what is said on this subject in the official report of Baron Moulet to M. de Sartine on the demands of the Portuguese Jews in 1776. No traveler has seen a plot of ground plowed by Jews, a manufacture created or supplied by them. In every place into which they have penetrated, they are exclusively given up to the trades of brokers, dealers in second-hand goods, and usurers, and the richest among them then become merchants, chandlers, and bankers. The King of Prussia wished to establish them in his states and make them citizens. He has been obliged to give up his idea because he has seen he would only be multiplying the class of retailers and usurers. Several princes of Germany and barons of the empire have summoned them to their states, thinking to gain from them great advantages for their commerce. But the stock jobbing of the Jews and their usury soon brought into their hands the greater part of the current coin in these small countries, which they impoverished in the long run. This is what Werner Sombart says to us. It is really time to give up once and for all the legend according to which the Jews were obliged during the European Middle Ages and above all, since the Crusades, to devote themselves to usury because all other professions were closed to them. The 2,000-year-old history of Jewish usury previous to the Middle Ages suffices to indicate the falseness of this historic conclusion. But even in that which concerns the Middle Ages and modern times, the statements of official historiography are far from agreeing with the reality of the facts. It is not true that all careers in general were closed to Jews during the Middle Ages and modern times, but they preferred to apply themselves to the lending of money on security. This is what Butcher has proved for the town of Frankfurt on the Main, and it is easy to prove it for many other towns and other countries. Here is irrefutable proof of the natural tendencies of the Jews for the trade of moneylenders. In the Middle Ages and later, we particularly see governments striving to direct the Jews towards other careers without succeeding. Today, the operations have become extended. Instead of lending to private individuals, they lend to governments and to states, but the principle has remained the same. The Jews are international financiers and not producers. For the producer is a conservative, and the other is not. Finally, the Jews have a bad influence for us by the use which they make of gold. The financial help offered by them to the Russian Revolution is a well-known fact. Reviewing a recent book by Mr. Lancelot Lawton, the 7th April number of the Patriot wrote, Mr. Lawton, in one remark, throws a sidelight on the moving forces behind the revolution, which might suggest to him further investigation as to origin of what has become a world movement. That movement cannot any longer be shrouded by superficial talk of the severity of the Russian regime, which is so favorite an excuse among our socialists for the most atrocious action of the Bolsheviks, who did not come into power till 6 months after Tsardom was ended. I wish to emphasize the paramount role which the power of money played in bringing about the revolution, and here it may not be out of place to mention that well-documented works have recently been published in France proving that neither Robespierre nor Danton were isolated figures upon the revolutionary stage, but that both were puppets of financial backers. Again, on page 42, he says, when the first revolution broke out, Lenin was in Zurich, where he was financially helped by an old Swiss merchant who later went to Russia to live as a permanent guest of the revolution and sometimes afterwards disappeared. If Lenin had not obeyed the orders of his paymasters, how long would he have remained in the land of the living? International financiers are not, however, all Jews, and they are not necessarily all vampires. Some of them, and the Jews, are far from being behind in this respect, are celebrated for their charity. Money losses in their hands and its usual signification have become a force, an instrument of power and sometimes of domination, such is the case for Jewish high finance. On the other hand, Jewish high finance is very powerful. On the other hand, it is linked up throughout the world and serves Jewish interests to the detriment of others. Its strength is in its organization and internationalism. It is not the individual success of the Jewish banks which is in dispute. They have as much right to it as we, and no one contests it. But here we have to do with an international system of banks which are neither English nor German nor French, but Jewish and all connected with each other. It is neither the importance nor wealth of single banks, but the importance and wealth of the whole, which makes the strength of the system. Walter Rathenau, in a communicative mood, once said, 300 men who all know each other direct the economic destinies of the continent, and they look for successors among their friends and relations. This is not the place to examine the strange causes of this strange state of affairs, which throws a ray of light on the obscurity of our social future. It is certain that such an organization constitutes a powerful force, capable of being used for good or for evil. Up to the present, it has been employed for the good of the Jewish race and to the detriment of the others. These forces do not seek publicity. They are generally content to manage affairs from a distance by means of their banks or of their delegates, and the world does not know them. At the necessary moment they appear suddenly and then as quickly recede into the background. A recent illustration of this fact happened during the peace conference at Versailles, where the preponderance of Jewish influence was one of the facts which impressed observers most, and which Dr. E.J. Dillon has thus expressed. It may seem amazing to some readers, but it is not the less a fact that a considerable number of delegates believed that the real influences behind the Anglo-Saxon people were Semitic. The formula into which this policy was thrown by the members of the conference, whose countries it affected, and who regarded it as fatal to the peace of Eastern Europe, ends thus: henceforth, the world will be governed by the Anglo-Saxon people, who, in turn, are swayed by their Jewish elements. At present, the Jewish high finance is all-powerful and serves Jewish interests exclusively. It would, moreover, be perfectly just to maintain that this is its right, only it is equally our right to oppose this foreign domination. For gold is only one of the weapons of Israel, a weapon of incalculable power, and to it alone yields that other force which the chosen people knows so well how to handle, the press. Let us now examine Jewish influence in the press. The Jews and the press. The power of the press is incalculable. The newspaper has become the great school for adults. It is almost their only source of information. Public opinion is only the reflection of the newspapers. In a well-informed study on the power of the press from Grossmarkt Press, an Austrian writer, E. Burl, has said, "An intelligent man thoroughly familiar with the newspapers can, after half an hour's conversation, tell anyone what the newspaper he reads, even high prelates of Rome, even cardinals, Emetic and Mercier, show themselves more influenced by the press of their country than they themselves probably realize. Often I have noticed that it is according to his newspaper that one judges the papal bull or the speech of the Prime Minister." An English prelate has said, "If in England the Bible maintained one thing, and the Times maintained another, out of 510 persons, 500 would be of the opinion of the Times." The former minister, Combes, promoter of the anti-religious struggle, said, "3/4 of the Catholics have been estranged from the Church by the press." And Cardinal Mercier, during his tour in America, was able to say with truth that it was thanks to the press that the Entente had won the war. One cannot exaggerate the influence of the newspaper, which ceaselessly, day by day, and even hour by hour of the day, holds forth everywhere, in the family, in the club, in the street, in the train, in factories, and in the fields, in towns, and in the country. Thus, M. Nordau, a Jew, has gone so far as to affirm that far more than all other modern inventions, it is the press which gives to our age its character, and of which it is the greatest force. More than any one, the Jews have understood the importance of the press. "What are you arguing about?" said one of them, Baron Montfiore. "So long as you do not have in your power the press of the whole world, all that you do will be in vain." Thus they have almost universally made themselves masters of it, for the press is not and cannot be independent. A newspaper is, before everything, a commercial enterprise, and its primary concern is to live and to make as much money as possible. A sincere independent newspaper, admitting that it could express its opinions freely, which is not at all certain if they were anti-revolutionary, would have to meet an annual deficit, the sale price of the paper hardly paying for more than the paper upon which it is printed. Professor Lester T. Ward, in his book Pure Sociology, has quoted the words pronounced by the journalist John Swinton during a banquet of the press in New York. "An independent press does not exist in America except perhaps in small country towns. Journalists know it, and I know it. Not one of them dares to express a sincere opinion. If they do so, they know beforehand that it will never be printed. I am paid $150 in order that I should not put my ideas in the newspaper for which I write, and that I should keep them to myself. Others are paid similar salaries for a similar service. If I succeeded in having my opinions published in a single issue of my newspaper, I should lose my post in 24 hours. The man who would be insane enough to give frank expression to his thoughts would soon find himself in the streets on the lookout for another occupation. It is the duty of New York journalists to lie, to threaten, to bow down to the feet of Mammon, and to sell their country and their race for their salary, that is to say, for their daily bread. We are the tools and the vassals of the rich who keep in the background. We are puppets. They pull the strings, and we dance. Our time, our talent, our life, our abilities are all the property of these men. We are intellectual prostitutes. It is natural under these conditions that sincere men and men of talent should withdraw more and more from journalism. A newspaper depends on the government, on news agencies, on commercial advertisements, and above all, on the financial power of those who own and direct it. No government could continue with absolute liberty of the press. So, governments exercise as strong an influence as possible by various means, of which the principal are financial corporation, favors, and the use of the courts. The extreme limits of misleading propaganda were exceeded on both sides during the war. The corruption does not consist in the government exercising influence on the press. Such pressure is often necessary, but in the fact that it is exercised secretly, so that the public believes that it is reading a general opinion, when in reality it is a minister who speaks, and the corruption of journalism does not consist in its serving the state, but in its patriotic convictions being in proportion to the amount of a subsidy. From the point of view of news, a newspaper depends principally upon news agencies. These are vast organizations which centralize the news of the world and distribute it to the press. From a commercial point of view, a newspaper lives only by advertisements. This fact is too well known to require further demonstration. The situation, then, is the following. The great telegraphic agencies of the world, which are everywhere the principal source of news for the press, just as wholesale business supply the retailers, which spreads far and wide that which the world should know or should not know, and in the form which they wish. These agencies are either Jewish property or obey Jewish direction. The situation is the same for the smaller agencies which supply news to the newspapers of less importance. The great publicity agencies which receive commercial advertisements and which then insert them in the newspapers at the price of a large commission for themselves are principally in the hands of the Jews. So are many provincial newspapers. Even when the Jewish voice is not heard directly in the press, there comes into play the great indirect influences, Freemasonry, finance, etc. In many places, Jews content themselves with this hidden influence, just as in economic life they consider joint stock companies as the most profitable. The editors may quite well be Aryans. It is sufficient that in all important questions they should stand for Jewish interests, or at least that they should not oppose them. This is achieved nearly always by the pressure of advertisement agencies. M. Iberile gives complete statistics of the world press, country by country, from which it appears that in Germany 3/4 of the newspapers are Jewish, as well as the news agencies, Wolf and the 2 other secondary agencies, Hirsch and Press Telegraph. The situation is almost the same in France. Already in 1984, Rochefort said, "Look at the press. There is no longer a French press. It is all in the hands of Jews." On the whole, however, Masonic influence is more evident in it than Jewish influence. Mrs. Webster, speaking of the English press, writes, "It would not be an exaggeration to say that there is hardly a newspaper in this country, with the exception of the Patriot, which dares to speak freely on questions touching Jewish interests. The advertisement agencies which distribute advertisements to the papers are a powerful means of pressure, the Jews who withhold them being thus able to cut off supplies from any newspaper by withdrawing from it advertisement contracts." The story of the Jewish contest with Gordon Bennett, the proprietor of the New York Herald, is very suggestive in this respect. Austria, before the war, offered us an example of the result of Jewish domination of the press. The Jewish press of Vienna sold everything, put everything at a price, artistic fame as well as success in business. No intellectual production, no work of art has been able to see the light of day and reach public notice without passing by the crucible of the Jewish press, without having to submit to its criticism or to pay for its approval. If an artist should wish to obtain the approbation of the public, he must of necessity bow before the all-powerful Hebrew journalists. If a young actress, a musician, a singer of talent should wish to make her first appearance and to venture before a more or less numerous audience, she has in most cases not dared to do so unless after paying tribute to the desires of the Jews. Otherwise, she would fear almost certain failure. It was despotic tyranny re-established this time for the profit of the Jews and brutally exercised by them in all its plenitude, such as it is revealed by its results. The Viennese press, dominated by Judaism, has been absolutely disastrous. It is a work of death which it has accomplished. Around it and outside it all is void. In all the classes of the population are the germs of hatred, the seeds of discord and of jealousy, dissolution, and decomposition. The import of Jewish influence in the press. Naturally, Judaism, master of a part of the press, uses it to serve Jewish interests, notably in preventing any anti-revolutionary publications and in spreading throughout the world ideas favorable to Judaism. All anti-revolutionary campaigns from their beginning meet with systematic obstruction from the press, which shows itself either by silence, refusal to publish, or by violent attacks, without possibility of replying against the individual who dares to attack the revolution even indirectly. If one dares to denounce the Jews directly, then there is a general hue and cry, and the culprit is usually rendered powerless to hurt in a very short time. The press, being irresponsible and anonymous, does not draw back from any distortion of news, lies, calumny. Thus, we see the universal press, including a part of the conservative press, bellow and stir up opinion against Mussolini, whom it calls a barbarian tyrant when he expels a revolutionary from Italy, though this same press passes over almost in silence the 3 million Russians executed by the Bolshevist Cheka. Naturally, in many conservative or so-called conservative newspapers, there appear anti-revolutionary articles. The contrary would be too strange, but they are carefully doctored so as to be only a semblance and not to touch the inner meaning of revolution. The skill consists in directing organs of all the parties from Bolshevism to the extreme right. This permits the neutralization of public opinion by maintaining its tranquility and its direction in the desired way by a subtle propaganda presented to each class of reader in the form which makes it acceptable. The masters of the press do not use it only to avoid all attack, but also to spread universal ideas which favor Judaism, whence the general tendencies of the world press, which is on the whole liberal, democratic, republican, socialist, anti-religious, materialist, in a word, revolutionary in general. Jewish influence in the world. The same influence is also exercised, although less widely, in literature, achieving by subtle advertisement the reputation of those authors whose ideas are considered useful to the revolution. In a wide sense, every idea is useful which disintegrates Christian society. Liberalism, sensuality, materialism, determinism, etc. Freud, Einstein are examples. As in the press, obstacles are placed in the way of those who are hostile to it, and if that is not sufficient, more energetic means are then employed. It is very instructive in this respect to note the struggle which has been necessary in each country in order to get the protocols published and the rapidity with which they have disappeared from circulation. The following is a significant passage on this subject by the English historian N.H. Webster. When I first began to write on revolution, a well-known London publisher said to me, "Remember, that if you take an anti-revolutionary line, you will have the whole literary world against you. This appeared to me extraordinary. Why should the literary world sympathize with a movement which, from the French Revolution onwards, has always been directed against literature, art, and science, and has openly proclaimed its aim to exalt the manual workers over the intelligentsia? Writers must be proscribed as the most dangerous enemies of the people, said Robespierre. His colleague, Dumas, said all clever men should be guillotined. The system of persecution against men of talents was organized. They cried out in the sections of Paris, "Beware of that man, for he has written a book." Precisely the same policy has been followed in Russia under moderate socialism in Germany. The professors, not the people, are starving in garrets. Yet the whole press of our country is permeated with subversive influences, not merely in partisan works, but in manuals of history or literature for use in schools. Burke is reproached for warning us against the French Revolution, and Carlyle's panegyric is applauded. And whilst every slip on the part of an anti-revolutionary writer is seized on by the critics and held up as an example of the whole, the most glaring errors not only of conclusion but of facts pass unchallenged if they happen to be committed by a partisan of the movement. The principle laid down by Collot de Hébrois still holds good. Tout est permis pour quiconque agite dans les scènes de la Révolution. All this was unknown to me when I first embarked on my work. I knew that French writers of the past had distorted facts to suit their own political views, that a conspiracy of history is still directed by certain influences in the Masonic lodges and the Sorbonne. I did not know that this conspiracy was being carried on in this country. Therefore, the publisher's warning did not daunt me. If I was wrong, either in my conclusions or facts, I was prepared to be challenged. Should not years of laborious historical research meet either with recognition or with reasoned and scholarly refutation? But although my book received a great many generous and appreciative reviews in the press, criticisms which were hostile took a form which I had never anticipated. Not a single honest attempt was made to refute either my French Revolution or World Revolution by the usual methods of controversy. Statements founded on documentary evidence were met with flat contradiction, unsupported by a shred of counter-evidence. In general, the plan adopted was not to disprove, but to discredit by means of flagrant misquotations, by attributing to me views I never expressed, or even by means of offensive personalities. It will surely be admitted that this method of attack is unparalleled in any other sphere of literary controversy. The theater, the cinema, even wireless are powerful means of influencing public opinion, so they are profoundly imbued with Freemasonry and Jewish ideas. Not only their directors and their actors, but also the general tendencies of their preponderant ideas in the cinema. Most of the films given in Europe come from the great American firms, such as the Metro-Goldwyn, the Fox Film, etc., which are all almost entirely Jewish. The revolutionary tendencies of the everyday theater have often been described. N.H. Webster, speaking for England, writes, "We have only to look around us in the world today to see everywhere the same disintegrating power at work in art, literature, the drama, the daily press, in every sphere that can influence the mind of the public. Our modern cinemas perpetually endeavor to stir up class hatred by scenes and phrases showing the injustice of kings, or the sufferings of the people, the selfishness of aristocrats, regardless of whether these enter into the theme of the narrative or not. And in the realm of literature, not merely in works of fiction, but in manuals for schools, in histories and books professing to be of serious, educative value and receiving a skillfully organized boom throughout the press, everything is done to weaken patriotism, to shake belief in all existing institutions by the systematic perversion of both contemporary and historical facts. I do not believe that all this is accidental. I do not believe that the public asks for the anti-patriotic or demoralizing books and plays placed before it. On the contrary, it invariably responds to an appeal to patriotism and simple, healthy emotions. The heart of the people is still sound, but ceaseless efforts are made to corrupt it. The disintegrating influence extends to all branches of human activity, to science, to art, and to fashions with subversive theories such as Freudism, Theosophy, Christian Science, and certain general artistic tendencies seeking to overthrow the hitherto established rules of what is beautiful. On the subject of arts, and especially of painting, it may be remarked that Jews have been entirely absent from them in the past, that is to say, in the time when artists achieved reputation late in life after an existence of labor and hardships. The painters, Israel, Pissarro, are rare exceptions. But since pictures have become the object of an intense and fruitful trade, we are not speaking here of quality, but of quantity. The Jews have taken possession in increasing number of the professions of painting, engraving, and sculpture. It goes without saying that in this work of disillusion, education plays a primordial part. Everybody knows the efforts made everywhere, and especially in France, to establish atheistic lay education. But as this happens openly, it is outside the scope of the present work, which is concerned to show the occult forces of the revolution. We only mention it then without going into details. We've just seen the revolutionary side of Jewish influence in the world in general and in modern revolutions in particular. It is now time to examine Judaism closely in order to know exactly what it is, what it wishes, what it has obtained. Briefly, its general organization.